Hello everyone, I am Tacet, and today I'm going to be going over everything you'll need to know about Arcane Traitstones in Gems of War. They are one of many resources within the game, and they are considered one of the most valuable of them, mainly because they are a Traitstone that are used for every single troop within the entire game to some degree. They're also the hardest possible Traitstone to get, even though they're the second highest rarity. There are 21 of them, making it the most of any one type of Traitstone. Basically, the three lower rarities of Traitstone each have 6, one of each color, and the highest rarity of Traitstone, the Celestial Traitstone, is only one of its kind. So even though it's technically the rarest, there's only one of them instead of 21, which are what the Arcanes are made of. So we're going to be going over basically all the things to use these for, as well as how to obtain them. So, how to obtain them. You can get them pretty much from everything within this game. Every battle that you do has around a 3% chance of obtaining one, so if you go do a bunch of quests, or you go do challenges, or anything like that, or you go do PvP battles, arena, anything of the such, there is around a 3% chance at the end of every battle that the Traitstone that you get will be a Arcane Traitstone. Other than this, one thing to note is that every single Traitstone, when played within a kingdom, like if you were to do challenges, quests, or explore, is associated based on the kingdom. So for example, if you go under your hero and scroll all the way down to where we were before, where all these Arcane Traitstones are, and let's say we want to get red-brown Traitstones, we just click on this and then it shows us every single kingdom where this Traitstone is currently available. Then you just click on one of them and then it brings you right there, and any battle that you do within this kingdom will have a 3% chance of gaining that Traitstone. One other noteworthy thing to note is once you have completed a quest line for a quest, you will unlock the Explorer ability. This gives a 3 times chance that you would end up getting an Arcane Traitstone, and this brings it to around a 8 to 9-ish% chance that you would get an Arcane Traitstone from every single battle. So generally, if you want to get as many of a single Arcane as you want, you would search for which kingdom it is actually dropping in, and then go farm it within the Explorer. The most efficient or time-efficient way to obtain Traitstones would be every single week to go check the shop, save 100% of your glory, and use them only for the weekly new troops. Every single week there is a new event in Gems of War, and every single time there is at least one Arcane Traitstone that is given with these. Sometimes they are 2 Arcane Traitstones given as well in some instances, but as you can see, we can now get Arcane Stoic, which is pure blue, as well as Arcane Beast, which is red-green, both of which would technically only cost 300 glory each, and we can spam this as much as we want, making it really quick, assuming we have the glory to actually obtain these. This is one of the reasons why you generally do not want to ever buy glory keys in this game, and simply save all of your glory for the weekly packs, as this is the most efficient way to accumulate all of your Arcane Traitstones if you do not want to have to deal with Explore or other means of obtaining them. So what exactly do we use them all on? So let's go over absolutely every single color and basically give a early game option and a late game option for each one. So we're just going to start down from top to bottom on the list and start with blue. So, Wraith. This is an early game option that you can use for your blue Traitstones, the pure blues. This steals life from an enemy or their mana. Can be a pretty decent troop for its very low mana cost. The main reason it's really nice to trait is the fact it has both Death Touch and Chilling Touch. It is currently the only troop in the game that has a double skull effect like this. So given that it's a common, it is really, 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 really decent to use. There's one thing I also forgot to mention, which I should probably go over real quick. The amount of Arcane Traitstones you actually need per troop does change based on what their base rarity is. If you happen to level it from a common to an ultra rare, it will still go off the base rarity, but if they're base rarity common, it takes 1 Arcane for their final trait. For a rare, it takes 2 for their final trait. For an ultra rare, it takes 3 for their final trait. For an epic, it takes 8 for their second trait and 4 for their last trait. And for a legend, it takes 10 for their second trait and 6 for their last trait. And if you happen to get a mythic, it takes 2 9s for their second trait and 2 12s for their last trait. One other thing to note about each one of these bests in color that I'll be going over right now is I am deliberately excluding all mythics for 2 reasons. One, a lot of people don't have them, and the second reason is there isn't a single mythic in the game that is the best option for both the colors. So for that reason, I chose not to show any of them. So we went over Wraith. Penguin is the other one. Penguin is mainly done for blue, mainly because all of the blue hero classes aren't really worth getting. Penguin can be synergized with things like Crimson Bat, particularly using like 2 of them, whether that, a Draculus, or anything else like a Christine X that can do a lot of damage. The 5 stats that it gives to all allies can be quite useful, or all blue allies I should say. You can do this with all of the Guild War Guardians, but blue is a particularly decent color due to how many things within blue scale very well off of magic, which is one of the 5, of course, when you give all stats. So, next one, Giant Spider and Christine X for green-blue. The main reason you want to get Giant Spider is mainly because of its magic link, but just having this thing fully traded in general is pretty nice to have on your team. You end up getting the big trait, which will allow it to gain extra HP over time, and just using it as a utility in general gains a lot of mana generation. It also has a summon on it, which can be used for tanks. Christine X is by far the best green-blue option. Not only does it end up getting a stone skin on its second trait, but it will also get a enchant on itself whenever it takes purple. It is still to this day currently the only troop in the game that is able to place a enchant consistently on itself without needing to waste a turn. There are a few other options that have the opportunity to do it, but out of everything that has the highest consistency, Christine X is by far the best at doing that, and 2 mana every single turn from the enchant can definitely start to stack up pretty well, particularly if you're using multiple Christine X's. You can get a lot of value just from taking a single purple, more so than even taking a pair. So it's really good for stacking out. Deep Borer is used to synergize with quite a few early game troops. It creates a lot of brown. It's one of the best mana generators you can even have in early game. The main reason is that it destroys a column and then creates a bunch of gems. It basically makes the board smaller, so those gems that it does place can have a higher chance of actually landing. Not only that, but it ends up getting Water Link and Armored, which can help quite a bit just to mitigate some damage, as well as the Water Link to make sure it gets its mana up. Crimson Bat is one of the best true damage options in the game. This is generally pretty good to trait because on its final trait, it can deal 2 times skull damage to any wounded enemy. One really noteworthy thing to note about this 2 times damage is since it's based on wounded, which is anything that's missing HP, it is the only troop in the entire game right now that is capable of doing 2 times damage to every single possible troop. There isn't a single thing that this thing cannot do 2 times damage to. Most other 2 times options are limited, like for example this Divine Slayer is limited to only Divines, and if they're not Divine there's no way to possibly do 2 times to them. Bloodsucking on the other hand, as long as they're missing HP, which can happen to literally any troop, it will do that 2 times damage, so really good value, and one of the best skull oriented damagers in that regard. So next up, a pretty big cornerstone of early game, Knight Coronet. Really decent damage, some board control. Not only that, but he utilizes every single one of his traits very well. Leader for extra stats, Water Spirit for extra magic on top of his ability, which also stacks with leadership, and Stone Skin for a nice protective tank to have in early game. Really good, well-rounded troop for early to mid game. For when you're around under level 300 or so, this would be a really nice option to have, and probably one of the first things you would want to trait as a green-blue. I mean a colors, how do they work? A yellow-blue. So, Princess Elspeth. Princess Elspeth is something that you build quite a bit later into the game because most of her synergies are relatively expensive to make, including just trading herself as well. But essentially what she does is she has an Empower trait on her final ability. This allows her, or any troop that has this ability, to cast it from the very first turn. This is particularly useful with her because she creates a bunch of board control and gets a bunch of mana onto the board. She creates 11 of a chosen ally's mana color. So essentially it will choose a random color on a troop that you end up targeting this on, but if that troop only has one color, so let's say you use this on a penguin like I mentioned earlier, which only does blue, well then you're going to have a 100% chance that she's going to create 11 blue gems. So you can get a really decent amount of targeted mana generation that way, and it just leads to a very powerful start with quite a few different team synergies. And that's the main thing she's used with are things like Penguin and all of those Guild War troops that give 5 bonus stats to all allies of a certain color. Then she just kills it, makes a bunch of that color, and then whatever ended up accumulating that mana can just go crazy. Next up, Dragonian Rogue. There aren't really too many good early game blue purples. I figured I'd show this because this is one of the options that generally gets used in an early game all dragon team. Has a pretty decent boost ratio based on all the purples that it ends up destroying with its gigantic X. It also ends up getting stealthy and arcane giving even more damage on top of its pretty decent early game damage, and getting that stealthy trait will make sure it won't be targeted. Queen Mab is quite definitively pretty powerful. Not only does her mana burn do a ridiculously good amount of damage, it deals whatever their current amount of mana is, plus whatever her magic is. It can be completely negated if they have Impervious or Mana Shield, but assuming the enemy team has neither of those, she will just go absolutely crazy. She has an extra turn whenever there's a bunch of blues, and the main thing that she's generally used for is her ability to freeze on 4 times and 5 times matches. This can be really annoying, as many teams do go with an infinite loop or try to utilize extra turns, and any team that ever tries to do either of these two things will be punished very hard by her freeze. Her freeze essentially makes it so you do not end up getting extra turns on certain colors or on skulls if it's done on the first enemy. So the fact that she can just constantly keep freezing with this not only synergizes pretty well with a couple troops like Justice, but will also make sure that they can't really get that many turns, which is a core mechanic of this game, to be able to get as many extra turns flowing as you possibly can. So next ones. Brown Blues. Warlock is definitely a really nice option to get traded immediately with your Brown Blues. The main reason for this is it has Necromancy, which is actually the cheapest Necromancy in the game, if I'm not mistaken. If not, it's the second cheapest. I believe it's the absolute cheapest, though. But aside from that, it gets a Magic Spirit, which will help give it a little bit more damage, which can stack pretty well with its boost ratio. And other than that, it has Demonic Pact, which has a 25% chance to summon an Ancient Horror, makes for a somewhat decent second slot to use as a damage source, as well as a partial tank in the hopes that he would end up getting a summon. The most noteworthy thing he's really used with is with a Valkyrie in early game, and once you can start one-shotting some of the challenges, you can start using this guy, 3 of them with a Valkyrie, to start farming about 20,000 souls per hour as soon as you can start one-shotting things within challenges. So definitely a really, really potent troop, pretty vital to the whole soul farming mechanics that you can do within this game, and definitely one that you would want to get pretty early, though you do use him more towards mid-game, but early on in the game you would use him just as a moderate damage source. Core Vash is basically like a Queen Mab, except different types of disables. It instead of freezing a bunch and having a ridiculously high damage output, it is more controlled in that it has a stun on top of a stun drain. It'll basically, instead of keeping their turns under control, it'll keep their mana and traits under control instead. It does true damage, so it hit past their armor. It stuns them, which makes their traits do nothing, and it has a mana drain, which will fully drain whatever mana they have down to 0, regardless of how much they have. And really, really good disables, very similar to that of a Night Coronet and its trait setup, except slightly stronger in its ability to disable the enemy. Direwolf is a surprisingly really, really strong green. This thing could almost be considered a legend with how much it actually does, but it entangles and places a Hunter's Mark on the enemy. Entangle preventing them from doing skull damage, Hunter's Mark allowing you to do 2 times damage to them. It also gains an extra turn whenever there are 13 or more greens. Top of that, really cheap mana cost of only 8, and all of its traits work out pretty well. Earth Brand for a little bit of extra attack, which it utilizes really well. Entrapment, so it does 2 times skull damage to anything that's entangled, and as you saw earlier, it can actually entangle off of its ability, so that's 2 times damage right there. And a 20% agile to be able to dodge skulls that the enemy might use against you. And this entrapment does stack with Hunter's Mark. With Hunter's Mark. So that would be a 4 times skull damage whenever it ends up taking a skull, so quite potent in that regard. The next one to trade up is the Archer class. So if we go over to classes, there are a bunch of classes that you can upgrade in this game. Quite a few of them are pretty useless, though there are a few noteworthy ones, and one of those is the Archer. Archer class is the most well-rounded class in the entire game as of this current moment in time. All of its stats are pretty much right down the middle of the line, as you can see right here. All of them are pretty much as center-ish as you can really be, basically averaging at a number of 7. And if we go into the traits here, what really makes it nice is it has a 50% fast trait, allowing it to have half mana with every single weapon in the game, without the liability of having to set a certain perk. There are a couple other classes that can also start with 50% mana, but they need to be set as whatever their current type is. But you can actually set a different trait to have either attack or HP on this thing, instead of having to force yourself into whatever that type is to get the 50% mana. So really good in that regard. Not only that, it also has the highest chance to kill anything instantly with a skull in the entire game. There are a few other things that have like a 5%, like Krog the Dread. There are some things with a 10%, like the Assassin class. but out of all of them that can be triggered off a skull, this Bullseye ability on the Archer class is currently the highest possible kill chance to instantly kill off of a skull. So really, really nice in that regard. Both good for casting and for taking skulls. It's very well rounded and can cover basically anything you would ever need to cover within a hero. Oops, I'm gonna go back to troops, and where will we? Probably should have named these to give them a little bit more of an identification to themselves. Let's see, I think we're under here, yes, and we end up just doing that one, so down we go to the next one. So next up, we have the red greens here. So Dark Maiden. Dark Maiden, the main reason you want to get something like this early on in the game is it has some really decent board control. It transforms all yellow gems to a chosen color. So any yellow on the board can make it into whatever you want. You can make it into green, feed it back into itself, red, feed it into itself, or just some other color to go feed whatever else you want to go do. A really good yellow counter. Not only that, it has Nature Link to get it back into itself. It's relatively cheap. You can get its mana up in about 2 turns. Not only that, it also has a web off of its skull ability. Web is extremely underused currently in this game, but it's basically like a reverse entangle, where entangle stops all attack damage. This will basically stop all magic from being able to be used. Enemies will still be able to cast, but their magic will be brought down to 0. So if they happen to scale very well based on magic on their ability, they will be greatly disabled when they have a web on them. Other than that, the best red-green could be considered one of the 2 legends which have Impervious, but personally, both of them seem pretty weak, both Krog the Dread and Gloomleaf. I never really cared for either of them, so I'd say Marilith is probably one of the better later game options and early game options if you can actually afford to trade her. She does a static 6 true damage, so regardless of how leveled or anything you have her, she always does that, but she starts to destroy a lot of gems when you start getting her magic level up, and she also has the static 6 attack, but this destroying of gems is what really makes her useful. Because she can gain generally more than half her mana back just from casting her ability, at least this late in the game. Even earlier on in the game, she can still gain a pretty decent amount, and this combined with her Fire Link will allow her to basically cast, take 1 red, cast again, and keep repeating until you basically kill the enemy, or you keep getting mana generation on all of your other troops, so it works out pretty well. Ranger, I don't really need to say much. Pretty much most people know that this thing is what you should use when you start off in the game. The second anyone gets this drop, it is pretty self-evident that this thing is ridiculously strong early on in the game, and you will definitely want to get its traits up if you can afford it. Ends up getting Air Spirit, which gives you even more damage potential. Not only that, you also end up getting an Armor Piercing, which is a 50% chance just to ignore through their armor and just go straight for their HP, allowing this thing to sometimes 1-shot early on in the game, or definitely get 2 shots if you can get lucky enough to get both Armor Piercings in a row. Definitely a very, very nice troop to be using early on in the game, and if you're already using it, you might as well put some traits in it. Next up is the Forest Guardian, which is the later version of a green yellow. The main reason you'd want to get this is it gives 50% to all beasts. This is pretty useful for pretty much every all beast or partially beast team in the game. Even if you're not using a all beast team, you could still use this with something like a Hellcat to give that a quick mana. You can even use it just with itself to get a half mana on a cast that can make a bunch of skulls and give barrier to itself and all beasts if you happen to have other beasts. So a really decent troop. Not really something that's used as primarily a damage source. It's used more of as a support troop to beasts and anything else that can happen to synergize with it. So next up, we have the glorious Spirit Fox. Pretty much the best consistent drainers that you could ever put on a team. If you seriously needed mana drain on your team, this is the troop to trait. It is relatively cheap to do at only 3 arcanes. It is currently the only troop in the entire game that can start from the very first turn with a mana drain due to its empowered ability. It also has stealthy, so even if you choose, like, okay, obviously first turn you're not going to be using it, so you can just hold on to it, but then if they have anything else that can target you, or if they get really lucky with a cascade, they won't be able to, because you have that stealthy, so they won't be able to specifically target this troop. It does a 7 mana drain, has a decent amount of true damage, and a really decent boost ratio, particularly for early on in the game, if you happen to be able to get it up. And of course, Kraken for green-purple, that is no surprise, mainly because it has really high damage output. Not only does it have good damage off its ability, it has a gem spawn, has a chance to devour. It's also currently the only troop in the entire game that can hit through barrier. Barrier recently got the ability to be able to protect against devour. but unlike every other Devourer in the game, Kraken triggers its damage before triggering its Devourer roll, so the damage that it does will end up breaking the barrier, and then it will roll its chance to Devour. This also allows it to triple kill. If it kills the last 2 enemies, it will then roll its chance on whatever the next enemy in line is. So there's a lot of really potent potential for the Kraken. The reason he's so good to get traded is he has immune to stun, so he gets to keep both his traits. He gets huge for more HP, making him unkillable, especially since he ends up stealing stats with Devour. And on top of that, it also gets to do 3 damage to all enemies every extra turn, basically gaining the best value in the game pretty much for extra turns if you were to constantly keep extra turns spamming. Other than that, Soothsayer for brown-green. This is a relatively good empowered. Almost everything with empowered is a pretty good utility. If you have absolutely no clue ever what to really trait, just going with whatever has empowered is generally not going to be horrible. Mainly because almost every empowered in the game has some kind of purpose. With the Soothsayer, it's mainly for a very, very quick start kind of teams. Particularly if you're using something that you want to get up and get a little bit of magic into, like a Crimson Bat, or really just anything to get it kick-started. It ends up destroying a purple, and then the whole entire, basically, plus shape around it. And on top of that, it gives a little bit of magic. It can almost gain all of its mana back just from casting this if you use it correctly, or if you have a good enough board setup. Not only that, it also ends up getting Stone Link off its first trait, which will allow it to make it even easier to get its mana back up. Sylvania Mora, pretty mid-tier kind of troop, but it has one of the best skull counters in the game. Once fully traded, it has the great utility of being able to entangle the first enemy on the enemy team on whenever it takes an extra turn, or anything on your team takes an extra turn. This is very useful against any kind of skull spam team. One other thing to note about this is if you happen to take a 4-time skull and this kills the first enemy on the enemy team, it will then entangle the next in line. So even if you're doing something like that, it will still be able to apply the entangle. So it's very, very nice troop to be able to get the attack disabled on the enemy team. Next up, Pride Hunter for pure red for early game. Main reason you want to get this is just because it has the Fire Spirit to give it a little bit more damage, has that stealthy to make sure it doesn't get any of that targeted on him, and it also has the ability to silence the first enemy on the enemy team. This is somewhat useful in early game, as many people tend to run hero or their best troop in first slot, and this would basically completely disable the first enemy from being able to do their ability. For later in the game, for pure red, you would either want to go the Assassin class or, of course, the Courage. Courage gives a really, really good bonus whenever you end up taking skulls. Gives all allies attack and life every single skull that you end up taking, and this can keep stacking over and over time. And if you keep doing this with various skull spams like Keeper of Souls or really anything that can create skulls, it will end up creating a pretty huge amount of bonus. Most battles you can end up getting upwards of 30 additional attack and life onto all allies just from using this. Not to mention you can cast his ability on red skulls to feed red into other skull spammers you may have, like Shagra, as well as just putting more skulls on the board, which would then trigger his final trait, and you can just keep stacking from there. Valkyrie, one of the cornerstones of this game, and probably one of the most notorious troops for the longest of time. Not used as much these days, though still a very core troop in this game, mainly due to the fact that she's one of the core 7 converters in this game, or transformers I should say, plus she ends up gaining souls. The main reason why she's pretty good is she has a 10 mana cost plus a water link to a color that she ends up creating a very decent amount of. You can get her up in about 2 turns, throw down that blue convert, get a bunch of blues into a bunch of troops, and basically everything that ever uses blue in this game will be really good synergy with the Valkyrie. Great thing to get up early on in the game, though do keep in mind in an extreme early game when you don't have Magic Kingdoms, she will be pretty lackluster, but as you gradually start to get into the game, probably a month or 2 into it, she will start to be a core troop that you start using with almost everything for the most part. Anything that ever needs a lot of blue, start putting a Valkyrie in it. Moloch is the best red-yellow to go and trade up. Main reason for this is he's a nice single target mana drain. Not the absolute best mana drainer in the game. One thing that's pretty noteworthy about him is he does have that fire link, so that helps get his ability up pretty quick. It is possible to 2-turn him as well for all of his mana, though generally he is a 3-turn troop to get him to full mana. He also has suppression, which can lower down some random stats on the enemy team, though I would say that the fire link is almost more potent than his actual unique trait. So next one, we have our red purples. No surprise that Wisp is the best red purple to go trait. This thing is excessively overpowered right now. Assuming this thing gets nerfed, if you're watching this video at a later time, because I can 100% confirm this troop is going to be nerfed into the ground next patch. So if this happens to be nerfed, Miss Stalker is probably the better option. Miss Stalker, 10 mana cost, this bunch of true damage, really good early game troop. Every single one of its traits are very, very potent. It gets stealthy like this thing, and also purple magic link like this thing. It almost has all the same traits as this thing, actually. So yeah, just go him instead. But as this current moment in time, Wisp is very powerful. Only a 9 mana cost to be able to dispel all enemies, which removes all positive stats effects. This includes Barrier, Enchant, and Rage. Submerge, I believe, as well, which is a new one that was just added. It also charms a random enemy, which makes basically it targets a random one on the enemy team. The enemy then deals its attack value to the troop below and above it, and then it jumbles the board, which basically just completely maneuvers the board without directly giving you any extra turns, and then it manually gives you an extra turn, so you can go take those extra turns that it might have set up for you. And of course that's stealthy, so it can't be targeted by mana drain, or at least targeted ones. Has magic link, so it gets its mana up even quicker, and it has swift, so it basically almost starts with full mana, and with the magic link it's ridiculously easy to get that final little bit of mana on it. So very, very potent, can do a lot of damage. Seeing 2 of them is pretty common these days. Dragon Soul, probably my favorite troop in the game, and if I had to say what my absolute favorite is, it is definitely this. It's among them, but I'd probably have to say definitively that this is the best as far as my personal favorite. It's by no means the absolute best troop in the game. Early on in the game, it definitely is, though, if you happen to be able to get your hands on one. It does quite a few of explosions based on its magic off of its first ability, deals a lot of damage to all enemies, and it scales based on how many dragons are in the game. This thing can do 20 damage to all enemies with a full dragon team as soon as you get it, so regardless of how early game you are, you'll be able to do ridiculous amount of end game damage. Do keep in mind that 20 damage to all enemies once you've reached extremely end game content is relatively weak, but it still ends up being decent due to its explosions that it does. Not only that, but it ends up gaining souls, making this one of the best passive soul gainers in the entire game, behind things like Ferris Raw and Valkyrie. And other than that, it ends up getting huge off of one of its traits, and similar to Inferno King, which I don't think we got to yet, has a 25% chance to resurrect itself, making it pretty tanky and well-rounded in every single degree. Lava Elemental, one of the best boost ratios really in the game, as far as early game options, particularly good in Arena too. It ends up exploding a gem, so it gives you board control. That combined with its 10 mana cost is really potent. Deals damage to the first enemy, and it's boosted by Reds Destroyed, so if you destroy like 3-4 Reds, you're getting quite a bit of damage extra there. But on top of that, you end up getting a Burn, and many of you probably know who have seen Burn in early on in the game. Deals 3 damage per turn, can be really potent when you're dealing with lower stats earlier on. One really fun thing about Lava Elemental, particularly in an earlier game kind of aspect, is if you end up killing the enemy that the Lava Rage ends up hitting, it will then apply the Burn to the following troop. So you would end up killing one and then burning and pretty much killing the other one with the burn. So really nice and efficient with that. As far as traits, the main reason you get this is as Pyromania. It's one of the few troops in the entire game that has both a burn off its ability as well as the ability to actually do 2x skull damage, so really nice with that. Not only that, it also has Stone Skin. Basically anything with Stone Skin is a pretty decent troop with that 50% skull mitigation. Next up is surprisingly not a legend, it is Ragna Gourd. Ragna Gourd is a troop that is capable of exploding a bunch of gems of a chosen color. It is one of the lowest possible mana costs for an explosion in the entire game once it gets its Vash trait, which is one of the main reasons why you would actually want to trade it. It only takes 7 mana to be able to get this thing to full, making it really, really good if you need a gigantic burst of mana. You will be able to get this up in 1 turn if you get a +1 banner to your brown or red, and then get a surge on that color. Will give you full mana. So really, really, really good for getting that quick mana start whenever you need it. So definitely consider it for mana options. Centaur Scout, not the best of options, but there aren't really too many early game yellows that you can really use. It's not horrible. It has a bit of everything. It destroys a row. Destroy does give you the actual mana from it too. Do keep in mind, so if you destroy like 5 yellows, you're getting those 5 yellows back, and anything else you happen to hit. It also deals damage to the first enemy. Not anything too interesting, though the board control that you get from it can be somewhat useful. Other than that, it ends up getting a 20% agile, which will help it dodge skulls, which will be pretty well. A little bit extra damage, and the fast trait, just to make sure that the initial cast on it for the initial board control will be able to go up quicker than normal. You would need to make sure that you've set a +1 to your yellow to be able to use this properly, though. And next up is the wonderful Humility. Really good true damage counter on its final trait. Ends up giving all allies 2 armor and 2 magic anytime it takes HP damage. And since you're going to be taking a lot of HP damage when using a humility, if you just keep HP buffing him with any option, he can be quite potent against the enemy. He also has regeneration, which will help get his HP up. So he can keep tanking all of the true damage, and he'll just keep stacking up, giving you a lot of magic. He can actually gain... it's pretty much the best troop in the entire game to be able to give you magic. Not only can he get magic off his ability at a 1 in 4 chance off of his random skill gain to all other allies, but the extra armor and magic that he ends up gaining from his final trait, and even if he just dies and doesn't get to cast at all, he can normally get anywhere from about 6 to 10 magic onto all your allies, as well as armor, which can help a little bit in some situations. Next up is Herdmaster, somewhat similar to that of a Ragna Gourd, though it takes slightly longer. But one of the nice benefits of a Herdmaster is, well, it covers different colors, and other than that, it also has a Cleanse All Allies, one of the few troops in the game that can actually do this. This will get rid of all negative stats effects on yourself. One of the main reasons you want to get him traded up is on his final trait, you end up getting an Air Link. This will allow him to get his ability up even quicker, and depending on the banners that you go, you could possibly 2-turn a Herdmaster to be able to get that nice cleanse and the mana generation from it. Next up is Inferno King, very similar to that of the Dragon Soul I was mentioning earlier. It has a 25% chance of being able to revive itself, very potent, can be very annoying to the enemy team, and very helpful to yourself in those dire situations when you desperately need your troop to live or tank out a certain amount of damage. It transforms all greens to skulls, all browns to red, somewhat similar to that of the Forest Guardian that we showed earlier, except this is more of an offensive version of such. So, next up, the final 4s. So, Cockatrice for brown-yellow. This is a really well-rounded mana drainer and disable in general. It can entangle the enemy as well, or an enemy troop, as well as drain their mana. This will essentially make it unable to do anything, since its skull damage will be doing 0, and if it has no mana, it won't be able to cast. So basically, one Cockatrice can completely lock down any one enemy that you see as a gigantic threat on the opposing team. Not only that, but it creates a bunch of brown, and that's boosted based on the mana drained. So you could possibly obtain all of your mana back or feed these manas into another ally of yours. It also has an Air Link, allowing it to 2-turn its ability pretty easily, and to synergize with the fact that it entangles. If you happen to use it on the first slot on the opposing team, or whatever one happens to be next in line, you would be able to get that 2x skull damage whenever it takes skulls against it too. So brown-yellow, definitely by far, Gorgoltha is the best one. There are a lot of good brown-yellows out there, but Gorgoltha is... I would say the absolute best. The main reason for this is he is essentially the tankiest troop in the entire game, with a 75% skull mitigation to make sure that you don't really take any damage off of skulls. Also has a 25% chance that even if it does end up dying after a bunch of hits, that it ends up summoning a troop as well. The main reason you tend to use this is he has a really good mana generation combined with a cleanse to make sure that he doesn't keep any stats effects on himself, as well as giving mana to all your allies. And this generally is enough to get almost all of his mana back as well, so you can just keep spamming it. As far as purple options, not too many that you can really trait early on in the game. For early game, but I would say Skeleton could be an option. It's one of the only few troops that, when you're an early game player, that actually can consistently create skulls. It also automatically gains an extra turn, so you don't need to worry about accidentally using him incorrectly, because that's pretty hard to do, given that he automatically gains an extra turn, allowing you to keep going with it. But he ends up doing 2x extra skull damage to knights, and ends up gaining some nice immunities from getting his traits up. Next up is the Necromancer class. This is the most potent class you can possibly use when obtaining, when trying to do hero-based weapon damage. So this is the Sorcerer class right over here. It has the best first trait in the entire game as far as hero classes are concerned. It has the Magic Link ability, which is +1 to all purples that you end up taking, which synergizes really well with Creeping Death, as well as a few other full AoE purple weapons. Other than that, it has a 50% chance to gain 1 magic every single turn, and this is the main thing that makes it really potent and capable of being able to be the best caster of any hero class. It can stack up a lot of magic, just take them out with a really huge burst. And if you're using a full AoE weapon that hits all the enemies, every single time this thing gains magic, you're potentially gaining 4 additional damage against the opposing team. So very potent right there, and definitely something to highly consider for your purples, as there are not too many options to really do with pure colors for the most part. Oops, I keep clicking on the same one over again. So the final ones, Drake Rider for brown purple. There are a few brown purples that are good early on in the game. I would say Drake Rider is the absolute best. Not so much for its ability, even though it has an okay ability that synergizes with some dragons. But the main thing is it's currently the only troop in the entire game with 100% chance to summon a troop on death. This can be quite potent for tanking, since as soon as you die, you're just going to be able to get another troop ready to go right in its place. The only way anyone can possibly stop this is if they happen to stun this troop. So assuming it doesn't get stunned, there is no way you wouldn't get the 100% chance to resummon, or not resummon, but summon a new little dragon there. So really nice tank and good utility to have, and it's something that you can bring into late game, even though it's a early game related troop. Next up is Keeper of Souls. This can also do a bunch of summoning. Whenever it gets a kill on the enemy team, has a chance of summoning a white. Other than that, it's one of the 7 converters that can transform a specific gem to something else, in this case skulls, and is one of the better skull spammers currently in the game right now. Not only that, it ends up getting Necromancy, which will help you get some more souls, and that synergizes pretty well with the white that he summons, which also ends up gaining you souls. So works out pretty well as both offensive and somewhat defensive in the fact that he does have the chance to summon Golem. Even though it's last, one really noteworthy thing about this troop is it is the cheapest stone skin in the entire game. There is no troops cheaper than Golem to get stone skin on. It gets on its second trait. It's only a common, so really easy to actually obtain this. Definitely highly advised if you're a newer player and you have no capability of really getting anything with stone skin. If you happen to see this, or really any common that has stone skin in your inventory, just go and go trade that thing up, because getting stone skin, as I mentioned earlier, is a really potent trait, mainly because the AI, when it doesn't have any other moves to do, like no abilities or anything, will tend to prioritize skulls, and because of that, having a stone skin tank can be very useful for your team. Just to make sure that you don't really take any damage from skulls, or at least mitigate it as much as possible. Other than that, it also gets Stone Link on its final trait, and basically, if you haven't noticed by now, pretty much anything with a link trait tends to be pretty decent in most instances. Other than that, as far as pure brown, you would want to go Honor. It is the best armor buffer in the game, and if you happen to get it fully traded, it has a ridiculously huge buff where it gains 10 to all stats whenever it's being played in PvP. So in the context of PvP, it can be very potent, given that it basically gets anywhere from like a 25% to like 50% increase in stats, depending on how statted you currently are. It is pretty powerful, getting 10 to all. That is definitely not a small buff. That's a total of 40 additional stats just for having this single trait. And of course, can't forget about the stone skin. It does have stone skin. So as I mentioned, that is a pretty nice trait to have. So anyways, guys, that is basically a rundown of absolutely everything to use with your Arcane. I understand that this video was a bit longer. Generally, I only do these briefly, like when I do it on other videos, but some people have been asking for a gigantic compilation where I do all of them in one video, so that was basically what I just did now. If you still have any questions about Arcane Traitstones, how to get them, where to use them, anything about them at all, feel free to leave it in the comment section below. I hope this was helpful, and thank you all so much for watching. Goodbye.